Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Reflexology and Foot Reading Podcast. I am your host, Sam Belyea, affectionately known by my clients and students as the Foot Whisperer. And we are about to go deep with Cody Rickett, who is a licensed massage therapist, yoga instructor, and reflexologist in Tampa, Florida, USA. He is the perfect guest to talk about our topic this week, which is reflexology from a student's perspective. Welcome, Cody.
Hey everybody, it's great to be here and I'm really excited to talk about being a student in reflexology.
Awesome. So let's kind of dive in with this idea that you chose reflexology for a reason. Everybody finds this modality for one specific reason or another. What was yours? What were those initial moments that really drew you in towards this practice?
Well, I would say there's a couple different reasons that really drew me in. And what happened was I was going to massage school at Irwin Technical here in the Tampa Bay area. It's a great little school. I highly recommend it to anybody looking into massage therapy. But I was going to school at Irwin Technical, and Sam showed up to give a demo on reading the extremities and the feet in particular. So when you showed up, Sam, I believe there was 6 of us that got on the table. I wasn't one of the people that got on the table, but I was so impressed by the readings you did on the 6 other individuals that I went up to you after class, and I believe I asked you about something to do with the fingers on my right hand, related to zones 4 and 5. And you looked at my hand, and you kind of asked a few questions, and you gave a wonderful assessment that really peered into my history and to my present situation. So I was so impressed by the ability to read people based on their feet alone, and of course the hands and the other extremities, but the feet were the first thing I saw. So that immediately captivated me, the reading aspect. But then I've always been a big fan of, first and foremost, having my feet massaged and worked on, and then working on other people's feet, which a lot of people are afraid of, actually. It's a common thing in the massage therapy world. Oh, I don't want to touch their
Yeah.
feet. But I love working on people's feet because I love receiving it, so it's a kind of a two-way door type thing. So I would say it was the assessment and the power that provides in terms of literally like looking into somebody's soul, and then the pleasure that can come from the physical technique itself.
Excellent. So, for those of you who have been in the reflexology world for quite some time, nobody's mentioning years here, I want to kind of step into this idea that we always need to be learning and we always need to have this student mindset about us, even when we start to kind of age in the field. So, bringing us back to that initial moment, Cody, when you started taking your first reflexology classes, like what were some of those initial things that you thought were so important that maybe our seasoned listeners could walk down memory lane with? What were those bits and pieces of the reflexology practice that really stuck out to you in terms of importance?
Well, there's certainly a variety of things stuck out, but one of the first things was the diversity within the kind of feet that I was working on, even within my student class, which was about 10 people. So even within a relatively small group of people, there were radically different feet. So I realized, okay, I'm going to have to pay attention to these differences and I'm going to have to learn to navigate the differences. So it was a matter of like, well, how do I be consistent, or can I be consistent even when, these feet are quite different?
That's awesome. And I think that For those who don't have a lot of experience with various kinds of bodies or feet, like you learned reflexology very young in your massage therapy career. So only having worked on, the people in your massage therapy class and then jumping into a reflexology certification, as opposed to somebody who had maybe been in the field for a couple years before specializing, you really got a crash course in how different bodies can be very, very different. And that certainly affects the level of pressure, the various techniques that you're going to use, and also kind of how you customize the session for clients.
Totally. And if you don't mind, I'd like to give an example of working on my family members.
Yeah, go for it.
So, yeah, when I first started the reflexology certification, my family became my guinea pigs. And what comes to mind is I worked on my grandfather, and then I worked on my aunt, separately, of course, not simultaneously.
That would be awesome.
Maybe one day I could try that. But so with my grandfather, he's an old man. He's has a variety of health issues, and his sensitivity was really acute. So even the mildest of pressure, I was hearing like ooh ah. So I had to use super light pressure on him. And then in terms of markers, there was all kinds of different coloration, like yellowness, extreme dryness. So that got the wheel spinning in terms of my assessment abilities, which at the time were like I didn't know how to translate that into a narrative for him or for myself. So that was like a great first experience working on him. But with my aunt, as I mentioned, it was quite different because she is very athletic. She's a tennis player. She's accustomed to sports massages, deep tissue. So when I started thumb walking her feet, she was like, "What are you doing? You're like tickling me." you know? So she was like wanting more pressure. And in terms of her markers, she certainly had some, but they weren't nearly as blatant and obvious as my grandfather. So it was great tester in terms of how do I assess when the markers are obvious and when the markers are not so obvious, and how do I accommodate with different pressure.
Awesome. And you find that that directly translates into the clients that you're seeing now?
Totally, totally. Um, Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I could talk a lot about that.
Well, give us a couple examples. Like, I think one of the struggles with the new reflexology student is that they think that they're going through it all alone, and it's really scary because they don't know what they're doing. They've maybe taken their first class or couple classes, and they have all of these anxieties about whether or not they're doing it right. But what it sounds like you're saying is that from the minute that you start to put your hands on somebody's feet or other extremities based on the school that you learn from, you're learning about how to handle real world cases. So it doesn't matter if it's, a close friend or family member or a client on the table, the same lessons apply. So give us some examples about kind of what that looked like translated into, the actual client practice.
Sure, sure. Well, actually, a good example that comes to mind is that we did an event for Sam's book signing, which was really cool because we had like, I don't know, probably 30 people show up. And I was giving reflexology sessions, but they were relatively short, probably 15 or 20 minutes. But it was a great survey of different feet changing really quickly. So normally with a reflexology session, if it's an hour, I'll have at least 30 minutes to kind of recharge, clear my mind, get ready for the next client. But with the book signing event, it was like one person right after the other, so I had to kind of switch gears quickly. So I had one guy who, on the exterior, he seemed like, oh, I'm tough and strong, and I can take lots of pressure. So I started working on him, but I was using like moderate pressure, and he what's the verb I'm looking?
Started like guarding.
Yeah, and he actually winced. That's the verb,
Mm.
winced. Like, and somebody was watching from me from behind. He's like, and she said, "Ooh, you hit something," So That was a classic example of on the exterior, you would think that this guy wants really deep pressure, but in reality, he's quite sensitive and he needs to be kind of, we need to adjust appropriately so that to honor his sensitivity. And then, like, the very next client, I had a woman who needed the exact opposite. She needed deep pressure, and but I couldn't necessarily tell that just from her disposition or her face or anything like that. Fortunately, she started communicating with me and and saying like, so why are you using the pressure you use? And I said, well, why are you asking? And then Sam had seen her. You'd seen her before, so you said it. Well, she needs deep pressure, so
Yeah.
but
I,
yeah.
what I find and kind of what we had talked about in that moment is this idea of clients falling on a bell curve, and everybody is so different, and reflexology is a modality that really caters to everybody, regardless of who's on the table. You know, the job of a reflexologist is to provide a service at the end of the day that triggers the body's healing response. So some clients will need that feather light pressure, and if you go any deeper with them, you know, they're going to start to wince and guard and shut out the impulses from the session. A majority of clients fall somewhere in between on that bell curve. They're, you know, in that 3 to about 5 out of 10 in pressure range. But then there are some clients where they're just wired differently to the point where they need those 6, 7, 8 out of 10, sometimes even 9 or 10 out of 10 in pressure to even start to feel the work. And I've had multiple clients who have, you know, it's almost like the energy in the room flatlines because they're just not receiving what they're not picking up what you're putting down. And that process starts to become very apparent when you're needing to customize as opposed to just kind of going through the same routine day in and day out. So with all of the bodies that you've worked on so far, what are some maybe tips as far as adjusting to a client's preference that you can talk about, and like for new reflexologists just starting out?
Well, again, I think the main thing is communication. So, for for instance, some clients will directly say, "Hey, can you increase the pressure?" So, being open and receptive to whatever they're going to communicate verbally, of course, that's really easy. If they communicate directly what they want, it's a no-brainer in terms of, okay, I'll adjust accordingly. But the challenge is, how do I read other signs if they're not verbally communicating with me? Which actually, more often than not, they're not verbally communicating because they themselves want to relax and go into a kind of a deep trance and a deep healing state. So fortunately, there are clues and signs and symptoms that we can look for to make sure that the body is receiving the work well. One of them, of course, is a change in breathing. So it's just a wonderful thing when you hear that subtle change in breathing. They're breathing deeper. It sounds like they're in a semi-sleep state, maybe even a fully sleep state. Maybe they're snoring. If they're snoring, you know, okay, this your pressure is probably pretty good. You're relaxing them.
Technically a breathing change.
Yes, yes, a breathing change. So a breathing change is a great sign. Another good one is actually muscle twitches, whether in the feet or the legs or in any other part of the body, the hands, the legs. Any kind of twitch is an indication that the nervous system is doing the work. And we are all about the nervous system with reflexology. More than any other system, we're tapping into that, which in turn influences the other systems. Uh,
I think that might be like, especially for kind of pausing and talking like a new student in a session, first time new client, within that like first 100 feet that you're getting your hands on, it can be really scary. Like if a body starts to twitch uncontrollably.
yeah.
But you know, we've talked about this before. You actually view it as a good thing.
Totally, totally. Um, and because a word that comes to mind is rearrangement or circuitry.
Excellent.
Because that twitching is like, again, something's happening in the circuitry. And as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm a yoga instructor, so I have a deep appreciation for those kind of subtleties. uh, again, just on a personal level or in a solo context, when I'm meditating by myself, if I have twitches like that are involuntary, it's fabulous because it's beyond my own personal will. It's like my body's taking over, and I love that. So when I see them twitch, it's like, okay, their body's taking over, and it's not just the shallow level of the ego mind.
Excellent. So, what are some other signs that we can look for as reflexologists, or that new students can kind of keep their eyes out, peeled for, to understand that the body is truly receiving the work with a client?
Well, on the note of obvious signs, a lot of clients will like itch their face. That's a super common one. Again, a good sign that the nervous system is at work. But in terms of not so obvious signs, I would encourage new students to get in touch with your quote unquote intuition. And I think you mentioned a little earlier what's, when the room flatlines.
Hmm.
Like, so having that sense of what's the energy in the room, um, is there a welcoming, calming vibe that's kind of emanating from both client and practitioner? So, in addition to the obvious physical signs, I would say do not be afraid to tune in to your energetic awareness and use that as a barometer to how the session's going.
And in addition to those more subtle signs, I mean, I think they're equally important. You can't rule out one side of the equation. It can be loud and dramatic, like an arm flying across the
Yeah.
room, or the stomach starting to gurgle and
Oh,
growl,
yes,
you
yes,
know.
I forgot to mention that. That's a fantastic one.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
then there can be those moments where it's just like the client drops so deep that it feels like in the room you've been transported into another space, and
yeah,
all of those really subtle signs to let you know that you're doing a good job.
yeah, totally. And so I try to keep my senses tuned to whatever comes, whether it be subtle or obvious. And on the note of obvious, a couple days ago, I had a client who was snoring, and then she started talking like how a person talks in their sleep. And at first, I was trying to communicate, but then I realized, oh, she's not there. She's like, so again, great physical, quote unquote, involuntary signs that pop up.
Excellent. So back to this kind of first couple reflexology classes, new reflexology student, they're having to learn this fundamental routine that they're being taught, this hands on methodology of the work, how to manipulate the specific reflexes. What was the process of you learning your first round of reflexology techniques? What were some of those easy, hard moments, and maybe some tips and tricks that you can give to anybody who wants to learn reflexology?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the easy and then go to the hard. So, in terms of the easiness of the technique, it was very logical to me, the way Sam taught it. And so, in other words, we broke it into the 5 zones. We used the 5 zone theory to our advantage, and I would walk, zone 2 with 3 passes in vertical zone 1, vertical zone 2, etc., etc. So it was very rhythmic and systematic, and I appreciated that, especially because I play music. I'm not a professional musician or anything, but it's a major hobby of mine. So any time you can give me rhythm and patterns, I accept that well. So I really appreciated the simplicity of 3 times in this zone, 3 times in that zone, etc., etc. And it was uh, like a snake. It like winded its way across the surface area of the foot again in a very consecutive fashion. So the logic of it was like, I like this. This is easy.
Cool.
The hard part is like let's horizontal zone 2, the balls of the feet, and then dropping to horizontal zone 3, the more spongy part, like they feel quite different. Just in, we're talking less than an inch of distance. So okay, how do I adapt my pressure and my palpation to suit those while still being consistent with my 3 passes, So it's like okay, there's consistency with how many passes I'm doing, but maybe my palpation needs to change a little.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
think that's really important, especially for students who they've never really worked with the various surfaces of the foot. Like in in foot massage, like you're just rubbing the feet, but in reflexology, you're systematically going through and often in alignment with the major structures, including the arch, the tendons, the bones of the foot, so that you can really palpate the reflexes that are located in those areas. So in terms of, advising new students who maybe don't have as many feet underneath their hands as you do now, like what would be some suggestions to give them in terms of kind of solidifying their practice and gaining that confidence?
well, I would say don't be shy amongst friends and family.
Totally.
Yeah. Take all your opportunities to try them out and to get their feedback. Um, so that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing is if you are in a certification program, buddy up with your fellow students, because that's was fantastic for me and still is. That I love my fellow students that have graduated and that are still in the program. So working with them, working with friends and family is just gonna prepare you even further for clients that when the bar is raised because there's an exchange of money. But if you can work for free on your friends and family and your fellow students, I say go for that as much as possible.
I love what you just said in terms of, getting with your students, because that implies that you're both giving the work and receiving the work. And I think when you're learning a
Yes.
hands-on modality, it's this idea that, you need to give, give, give.
Right.
But I mean, we learn by receiving. So especially if, you are partnered with a student that has a very different style, a very different rhythm, like you said, I love that word, than you, it can be such an enlightening experience to receive from them, to say, oh, I really like how they did that. I really like their tempo. I really like their pacing. And likewise, I really didn't like it when they did this technique or that technique. And it
Yeah.
can be a learning experience for both of you as well through that difference of, just two people.
Totally. And so if you have a 2 hour block of time where you can be the practitioner for an hour and then you can be the receiver for an hour, it's an ideal circumstance for fellow students to work together. So I've done that quite a few times and I love it because, like you said, I'll say, hey, let me show you this and try this on me or vice versa. How exactly did you do that? Type
Mhm.
thing. So it's just the dialogue and the duo dynamic is really beneficial.
Awesome. So let's take it to that next level. And once kind of the technique is mastered and maybe you've graduated the certification program, but again, for those of you who are experienced reflexologists listening, let's take a trip back down memory lane. Talk about your experience seeing your first clients. Like, what was that like? And is there anything in this world that can prepare you for that sense of anticipation and touching those first like paying clients' feet?
Well, in regards to that, I would say that I was certainly nervous and even a little shaky, and I think actually my hands were colder than normal. And actually, they're not cold on a normal basis, but they were definitely colder than I had felt before. So there's that anxiety. But fortunately for me, I've I like being in front of people in general. I've done
Mm.
a good bit of public speaking. I'm an athlete. I've been on sports teams in which people are watching me from an audience. So I just used it like, okay, I'm nervous, but that means I'm excited. That means I care about what I'm doing. So I was able, and I still am able to use the nervousness and anxiety to first indicate that I care, that my heart's in it, and then to use it to transform into like compassion and kind of good energy.
Awesome. So what you're saying is that this sense of nervousness when seeing clients isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, I think it's actually a good sign, and I would actually be a little suspect if a new student or a new practitioner was not nervous at all. That's when I'd start to worry, actually, because To me, the nervousness is your own body generating energy so you can pour that energy out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like that. And we've been talking about this idea rhythm. So after you've seen those first couple clients and maybe you've gotten the initial jitters out or glitches out of your system and you've convinced yourself that you can do this, how does a reflexologist, in your opinion, go about finding their rhythm or their flow in their practice?
Well, that's a great question. And to kind of go back to talking about learning the basic routine within the certification program. So if you have a certain rhythm that you like, and actually I'm gonna palpate on my own hand right now, and I want to count out loud like a rhythm that actually Sam likes and that I use most of the time. But I'm gonna give you a difference. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's like a palpating rhythm of thumb walking.
So that's like when you're just walking over the reflexes and you're just basically going through the routine as it is.
Yes, yes, kind of the baseline, so to speak. But at sometimes I feel like I really need to slow down the rhythm. So here's the new rhythm, maybe first. Again, that intuition kicking in. I just feel like the client needs a slower rhythm. So it's something like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. So literally, like the tempo changes.
And especially with a modality like reflexology, we've talked about the power of the nervous system. Like just a subtle change in rhythm can make such a huge difference.
Exactly. And sometimes actually maybe I've needed to go faster because it is a client that likes hyperstimulation. They want the faster pace. And on the note of rhythm too, here's an interesting thing is, okay, let's say I'm doing my walking and then I come across a crunchy spot in the tissue or a spot that like, hey, I need to stop there and do some point work and just be still. So I'm still for like 30, 45 seconds, getting back into the rhythm of like that familiar, comfortable pace is important so that the client doesn't feel like, oh, I abruptly stopped and I've totally lost my sense of rhythm. So that's an art in itself with stopping and point work, like getting back into a smooth rhythm.
Excellent. So how would you suggest that we cultivate that sense of rhythm? Anything that you can kind of recommend to reflexologists, new or maybe experienced?
Certainly. I think we mentioned reading the client's signs and symptoms in terms of their breathing, but how about paying attention to your own breathing?
True.
That's super important. So I constantly need to take a look at my own breathing. If I feel like I'm like panting or like getting worked up, I tell myself, hey Cody, take a deep breath. And so breathing is a major barometer of rhythm and a way to maintain rhythm. So I would say use your breath with purposeful intention, and so that's a great way to maintain rhythm. And another way is what I would say call zooming in and zooming out. Sometimes if I'm too focused on a particular spot or particular zone, if I zoom out and I look at the client's whole body, and maybe even like close my eyes and just feel the field, feel the energy, that can be a great way to keep rhythm. Versus if I myself am maybe drifting off a little in my own head, maybe I need to zoom in. So it's zooming in and zooming out. That's a kind of a key thing to keep good rhythm and to ensure that the client feels safe, secure, and comfortable.
Awesome. And reflexology is, and as well as the art and science of foot reading, when you're lost inside your own head or you're not in sync with your clients, it really screws with your ability to palpate, which I think is such a powerful concept in all body work, but especially in reflexology and foot reading, because if you're not listening to the signs and signals that the hands are giving you, and you're, panting a mile a minute, or maybe your head's focused on the grocery list, you lose that sense of what's actually underneath your hands.
That's true. That's true. And I have a variety of tricks that I've learned from you and that I've brought from my own kind of experience with yoga and meditation and other massage. And it's just a matter of, first and foremost, putting the attention on the tissue, on the skin. And then, yes, going deep into the energy, into the more subtle aspects. But I would say, first and foremost, is returning to that palpation and the tactile touch. You can't go wrong with that, I think. And then the energy and stuff becomes a bonus in a way, a deepening of the experience. But when in doubt, return to literally, how does their skin feel against mine? Is there roughness here? Is there softness here? Are they perspiring? Is there, and then with the sight, is there redness? Is it pale? Is it yellow? Is it blue? Etc. So relying not only on the tactile touch actually, but on your other senses of sight and hearing and things like that.
How important is that kind of, I love this, where you're taking this discussion in terms of like this holistic sensory experience of the session for a reflexologist. Like, do you find that when you're really opening up all of your senses at once, that it contributes to a greater kind of session outcome?
100%. And we had a certification class in which we specifically focused on the quote-unquote extrasensory abilities. So things like clairaudience, clairsentience. In other words, we have the ability to sense externally, but we also have the ability to sense internally. So if I'm in tune to both my external and internal senses, the client is going to, again, involuntarily, automatically open their external senses and their internal senses. So I think it's just a win-win situation. If I'm willing to open my senses fully, then the client's going to automatically feel that kind of willingness and kind of drop into the deep relaxed state, and the parasympathetic nervous system's going to go to work.
I love that. And I think with reflexologists nowadays, we get so wrapped up on reflexology being hands-on that we often forget that we're two people, not just meat suits, but we're two kind of energetic expressions that are in the same room together. And so those vibes that are being thrown back and forth, like they are both physical in terms of you are working on tissue and the client is feeling your pressure and your touch, but they are also extrasensory, like you said. So not necessarily focusing on too much on one side or the other, but idealistically, foot readers and reflexologists should have that all senses on feeling during their work to make sure that they're not missing any part of the dynamic that's going on.
Totally. And I love the term you used, meat suit. I mean, that's funny, but it's very true and real. But let's throw out another term, luminescent radiant being. A luminescent radiant being in a meat suit.
Oh my God.
So that's the fullness, that's the holistic approach we're talking about. You have to work with the meat suit, but you also have to be willing to get in touch with the luminescent radiant being that's underneath the skin.
Okay. So for new reflexology students, I find that clients will gravitate towards one side of that equation versus another. They'll want to just talk about the language of bones, joints, glands, physical pathologies, but then other clients are really, for lack of a better word, kind of hippie about it, and they're all about the energy and how things are manifesting, and this idea that there's this holistic interconnectedness. So how do you, as a student of reflexology, kind of balance those two approaches in your own head? Like, how do you speak both languages at once?
Well, what comes to mind, and this may be less of a student thing and more of a professional thing when you work with clients, is I would say try to start the dialogue before the session. So when they're filling out a health history form, they've just walked into your office, go ahead and try to get to know them and, without being forceful or overly persuasive, see if you can engage them in a conversation so you can tell, are they of the hippie variety or are they more of the purely physical, they just want.
The meat suit variety.
Yeah, the meat suit variety. Exactly. So I would say that's super important, to start a dialogue before the session. Because again, once you're in the session, it's not ideal to say to try to talk to them because we want them to relax. So work on those communication skills before the session even begins.
That's great advice. But what do you do with a client that kind of wants to talk during the whole session?
Well, I would say go with the flow, the path of least resistance. So if I resist their chatty nature, I'm just gonna do kind of harm to the session. So I'm willing to talk. If that's their vibe, I say go ahead and talk. But at the same time, I'm not gonna start
Instigating.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Or say like, oh, well, let me ask more questions, or let me talk about my own personal narrative of like, oh, well, let me tell you this long story that relates to that. No, I don't want to push it that far, but be willing to go the distance if they're so insistent on talking and being verbal.
But like back when you're out front with a client, either before or after the session, and you're trying to establish that pulse line, like who they are, what they're here for, do you find that most clients are interested in what you're finding during a session, or do they just kind of want to zone out? Like, what have your experiences been as far as the type of conversations that you're having and the feedback you're relaying as a practitioner?
Well, I would say the majority of clients are interested in any insights I can provide, mostly after the session. I would say it is a minority that would want a play-by-play call of what I'm seeing. But certainly those clients do show up that they want me to tell them what I see immediately as soon as I see it during the session. But most clients, more often than not, would rather, again, relax and enjoy the experience and then find out, oh, what did you see afterwards?
Okay. And is that really where we start to transform the hands-on art of reflexology into this craft of foot reading? I mean, as a reflexologist and a reflexology student, like you're learning this hands-on modality and it's wonderful. And maybe depending on where you're at, you also have a massage therapy background if that's required for you to practice. But then there's this thing that I know that I had to find out kind of independently. I wasn't taught this idea that the feet are the map of the person. So how do you, as like the student, start to slowly drip in that content and that feedback and take the hands-on work to the next level?
Well, one of the awesome parts of our certification program is that we do case studies. So we'll literally look at pictures of the feet, we'll identify the markers, like the top three, and then we'll build a narrative. What's happening here? And you, Sam, have fortunately worked with the client directly, so you can validate, okay, you're on point there, not so much on point there. So if you have a chance to do case studies with an experienced reflexologist, I would highly recommend that to hone your assessment skills. But again, the other option is work on friends and family and people that you're not so worried about getting it wrong. Because the biggest fear is, oh, I get it wrong with an assessment. But if you can do it with friends and family and fellow students, you'll get over that fear quickly. And even with a client where, oh, what if I get it wrong? Well, you can ask a question. You don't have to throw the dart at the bullseye right away. You can say, hey, I noticed something in zone 4. Have you been having any issues in your shoulders maybe? So asking a question is often the best way to start the assessment dialogue rather than you must have a shoulder injury, blah blah blah, which maybe I'm not to the level where I feel like I can always hit that bullseye. But Sam, maybe I've seen Sam hit it a bunch of times, but I think it's important to be honest with your level of confidence. like I'm super confident with my technique right now, but in terms of assessment, that's still like, ooh, okay, I'm getting there, but I'd rather kind of dip my feet in than dive headfirst.
Yeah, and I think students are really needing in the beginning to identify their strengths, and even reflexologists down the road. Like, some are going to be better at the assessment side, some are going to be better at the technique side. I didn't start really getting the jaw dropping responses from the work. Until I started incorporating the foot reading aspect, and now that's kind of what I'm known for. But when I get reflexology from certain practitioners, it's like they just have the hands for the work and they could be concerned less with this idea of assessment. So I think in the beginning it's nice to find those things that you're good at and nurture those strengths and not worry about developing the skills that have to naturally happen over time, yeah?
I agree with that 100%. I think technique should come first and then let assessment naturally blossom, and that's certainly my ongoing process. And but when you do accurately assess someone's foot and you get that validation, and then you move into the coaching aspect of like, okay, we've identified the problem, now let's make some suggestions in terms of how you can remedy it. I mean, that is a great feeling. So I am certainly motivated to keep moving in that direction of assessment.
Yeah, definitely. And with reflexology where it is now, and the fact that we're doing this podcast, even, and that there are so many online resources, you can learn from almost any practitioner in the world right now. If they have a social media profile, you can contact mentors, you can find the material online most times. But I think back to that idea of case studies that you were talking about, it's just about getting the experience and getting the whether it's the validation or the hands-on practice, trading with your co-students, and really just developing that skill set of whatever side of the work that you want to get good at, and following that sense of where you're naturally led to kind of dig and get good first
Yeah.
and foremost.
And on the note of assessment, what I've found as well is what comes a bit easier and more natural is finding the markers at first. So again, noticing abnormalities in coloration, texture, etc., etc. That can come a lot easier than building the story or connecting the dots between, okay, this most likely means it's a certain kind of injury, a certain issue with the pathology. So I would say to new students, get comfortable first just noticing differences in the
Mm.
visible signs and symptoms, and then the story comes more naturally in kind of the assessment. So again, it's all pretty logical, and it's like it's meant to be done. There, even though it can be intimidating for me, I feel like, okay, this makes sense. It's meant to be done.
Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. And it's really important when you're going through this whole process to have a mentor that you can actually connect with.
And I'm lucky to have you. So,
Yeah, right.
but that is the disclaimer of this whole podcast. I mean, I've worked with Sam for a full year pretty much now, and it's really been awesome. So, yeah, get a mentor. If you can get one in person, that's ideal. But even online or via correspondence, that's a pretty good deal as well. So,
Yeah, and I think even when I was learning hands-on reflexology, I didn't reach out as much as I should have because I thought that I knew it all. And it was definitely one of the things looking back that I should have leaned on some of those people to either pat me on the back or smack me upside the head to get those initial kind of fears, reservations, but also to push me to discover new things a little bit sooner than I did organically on my own. But now, back to that idea of the internet, I mean, the hands on modality is now digital, not in practice, but definitely in terms of knowledge and mentorship. So at this point, there's no excuse to not take your practice to the next level by learning from things like this podcast.
totally. And just as I think good reflexology draws from the surface level physicality and also the deeper, subtle, energetic things, a good reflexologist trust yourself, but you always talk to your colleagues, get feedback. So it's got to be a two-way street of I'm going to learn to trust myself and the quote unquote inner guru, to go back to my meditation and yoga background. The guru is in you, but that doesn't mean now that you're omniscient and omnipotent. You still need, feedback from other practitioners. So
Well, and this brings up a really good point. So, as the student is starting to become a little bit more advanced, or maybe a reflexologist who's been practicing the same way day in and day out is maybe ready to venture into a new style or a new rhythm, to use that word that we've thrown out before, what does it look like from your standpoint when you start to take the techniques that you've been given and that you've been taught and start to adapt them, change them, and grow within the field, maybe outside of the initial template that you were taught?
well, that's a great question, and you and I have been having an ongoing dialogue about that exact issue. And one of the things, in terms of my own self-discovery, self-realization, is, I'm an athlete. I love sports, and so I think I'm attracting more athletic people. So the question becomes, how do I spin reflexology to be more geared towards athletes, people that are seeking that kind of treatment? So for me, it's definitely an ongoing process, but I'm gonna keep, maybe I could take a sports massage workshop, and then kind of pioneer sports reflexology. Maybe I could be a bit of a pioneer in a niche within a niche.
There you go.
Yeah,
I mean, it used to be that it was just reflexology, and
yeah,
now there's aroma reflexology, there's extremity reflexology with the face and ears, there's reflexology using light therapy. There are nuances of reflexology that have developed now that weren't in existence, 10, 20 years ago, as it was just a fledgling modality. But now as it's starting to get popular, like, you can take this broad scope of this niche modality and turn it into almost any variation, including, busting some of the myths that are out there. We have reflexologists that are just focused on reflexology during pregnancy. Pre-postnatal reflexology is starting to get really popular. So, I mean, understanding that just that first workshop or that first certification isn't where the line gets drawn and you're limited to this box of techniques that maybe are a little bit rusty. You can always go outside the box and really discover new ways to use the work.
totally. I mean, and that's what keeps me wanting to learn more, meet new people within the broader network, both online and in person. So I'm just very excited about what the future holds for myself and for the field of reflexology.
Awesome. And new students, definitely, as kind of like a final note, keep that sense of excitement. And even to the reflexologists that maybe you're listening to this podcast and you've been doing it for, 5, 10, 20, 30 plus years, that sense of excitement should never go away, because reflexology is really a modality that has to come from the heart. And I think that the reason why there are so many practitioners out there that have made this their life's work is because the modality is inherently exciting. Like, it validates this magical interconnectedness of the body in such a way that really astounds both client and practitioner alike. So always keep that sense of excitement kind of rolling strong.
Totally.
And Cody, as we wrap up, are there any ways that the listeners can connect with you and kind of monitor your progress as you go through that student dynamic?
Absolutely. Of course, there's social media, Facebook. I have Cody Rickett, LMTRYT. So I'm constantly posting pictures, blogs, things like that. When Sam and I do an event together, like we recently did a webinar that was really exciting, and we got some interactive activity. So Facebook, you can check me out on Facebook, Cody Rickett. I also have a website, codyrickett.com, which I'm starting to put more content on. So, and of course, I'm affiliated with the Foot Whisperer. So if you go to the Foot Whisperer, you will find me very close with Sam in a lot of ways. So those are all good ways to follow me and to get in touch with me.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening to the Reflexology and Foot Reading podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow the Foot Whisperer on Instagram, our YouTube channel, and Facebook. We so appreciate you listening. Until next time, may the feet be with you, and we will see y'all
Yes.
later.